Welcome to Campfires and Trek. This is video 6 in the first module of the Reclaim Leader video training series, the overview of the Reclaim ministry model. We're taking a high-level look at all of the components of the Reclaim ministry model, and today we're going to look at Campfires and Trek. We're talking about what they are and why we do them. In future modules, we're going to talk about how to actually run a campfire or how to run a Reclaim Trek group. In this video, we're making a turn from covertly spiritual relationship building strategies to more overtly spiritual programmatic ministry. In a Reclaim area, the campfire quickly establishes itself as the most visible time of programmatic ministry in a community. You'll hear people say things like, "Hey, are you coming to Reclaim tonight?" Or "I'm going to Reclaim tonight." And what they mean when they say that is, "I'm going to the campfire." That's fine, it's not something that we have to correct or worry about, but it demonstrates that the campfire quickly establishes itself as the most visible presence that Reclaim has in a community. So before we get too far into the conversation about campfires, I want to start by setting the stage, giving you 5 key overarching principles that you should think about when you think about campfires. You guys really need to memorize these 5 principles. In fact, I'd like for you to open up your notebook and write these 5 points down as I give them to you so that you can have them in front of you as you watch the rest of this video. I want you to be able to refer back to them and think about them and really see the rest of this conversation about campfires through the lens that they provide. Every time you think about campfires, these 5 ideas should be at the top of your mind. Whether you're planning a campfire, running a campfire, or you're a Reclaim leader that's sitting in the audience of a campfire, you should be thinking about these 5 ideas. They're going to create a framework in your mind that's going to allow you to think more strategically and intentionally. So the first principle is this: everything about a campfire should point to the proclamation of the gospel. First and foremost, the purpose of a campfire is the verbal proclamation of the gospel. All of the content, all of the conversation is building toward and part of a gospel presentation. We're using this time and space to help men understand what they need to understand in order to make a decision to follow Jesus. Now, if a guy's come once or twice, is new to the campfire, he might be thinking that he's there so that he can grow in his masculinity or become a better person or learn how to better navigate life. But ultimately, the campfire is not about any of those things. It is about proclaiming the truth of the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus and what it means to follow him. The principle number 2, campfires are designed for the furthest out guy. Now, this principle should come as no surprise to you if you've watched the first 5 videos. But for some reason, when we start to get programmatic about things and start putting on events and meetings, it's easy to allow what we've seen other ministries do at events or at meetings or what we have seen in church begin to drive our thinking in terms of what programs should look like. Again, our vision statement in Reclaim is to see all men fully alive. So we care about the nominal Christian guy who's in the pew every Sunday and bored out of his mind. But if we build our program for him, with him in mind, we're going to exclude the men who are spiritually disinterested and don't think that they can darken the doorway of the church. But if we build our program with the farthest out guy in mind, not only are we going to win a hearing of the gospel with them and build a platform for them, but we will with everybody in between. We'll catch all of them. I don't want to say this in a way that sounds disparaging, but you almost have to think about it in terms of lowest common denominator. The farthest out guy is our target, and if we do a good job ministering to him, we'll minister to everyone else regardless of where they are in their spiritual journey. Always keep the farthest out guy in mind. Principle number 3, campfires are designed to help men have a positive experience at a spiritual event. If we're effectively going on expedition, leading guys through the adventure space and eventually to this campfire meeting, you're gonna have guys show up at this campfire who haven't been to church in decades. You're gonna have guys who have never been to church. You'll have people who have been to small groups and had negative experiences. You're gonna have people who just have a negative connotation about organized religion. And we wanna use this campfire meeting to blow up categories and to spin that perspective. We want men to have a positive experience at this spiritual meeting because we need them to come back. Campfires should be incredibly welcoming. They should feel low pressure. They should feel relaxed. A guy should show up at a campfire and think, this is a group of men where I can let my guard down around them and I can just be real. But men also have to be able to feel like, you know what? I don't want to engage. I can just be a wallflower and hang back and not participate in this meeting at all and just kind of take it in. They have to feel like it's safe enough that they can be themselves. And I understand that in ministry, especially when it comes to sharing the gospel, there are times when we need to be bold. The gospel isn't necessarily a comfortable message to those who don't follow Jesus when they understand what it really implies. It's an offensive message and it can create division, and we want to be able to give space to men and give space for the Holy Spirit to work so that they can feel the weight of their sin and the separation from the Father. I get all of that. But the campfire meeting itself needs to feel like a place where there's life. It needs to feel like a place that's safe. We're never going to call on men or ask them to participate. We're never going to have an altar call type moment or try to close the deal at a campfire. Reclaimed leaders need to make it a comfortable, safe, welcoming space for men because we want men to have a positive experience so that they can come back and allow us to continue to journey alongside them. Principle number 4, campfires should always set reclaimed leaders up for success. Reclaim is driven by relationship. Everybody that's at the campfire is there because a reclaimed leader brought them to the campfire. And those relationships are critical because most of the significant ministry that comes out of the campfire doesn't actually happen in the campfire meeting. Most of the time, it's in follow-up conversations that happen days, weeks, even months afterwards. That's the reason we can make the meeting feel super welcoming and not come across as aggressive at all. It's because all of the men that are there have reclaimed leaders in their lives, leaders that have earned the right to be heard, who've been trained in how to share the gospel, and who are willing to push in and have the more challenging conversations one-on-one and help men unpack these ideas that we've been talking about in the campfire meeting. So we want to create a platform for leaders. We want to showcase their wins. We want to spotlight them. We want to set them up for success in any way we can. When you're in a campfire, try to make other leaders the hero. Something that you may have heard said before is that 90% of leadership is perception. Well, use the platform that we have in the campfire to make it abundantly clear that these men are worth following, especially when it comes to spiritual things. You know, the guys in the campfire might know that Mark is a good golfer because they've followed him in the adventure space and they've learned a lot from him. Make it clear in the campfire that Mark also has a lot to teach me about this Jesus that we've been talking about. Point number 5, creating questions is more important than giving right answers. We don't approach campfires with an attitude that we're going to teach men a bunch of new concepts. Rather, it's more like we're allowing truth to reveal itself as we work through our stories and talk through conversations. We're helping men consider new concepts and ideas that they maybe have never considered before. You know, when you throw facts at men, oftentimes they go in one ear and out the other, unless we can see immediately how they apply and how they're relevant to our current situation. But if you can get a man to wonder, maybe about some aspect of a story that you just told. Or you can get him to question a long-held belief. Or maybe you show him how two things that he's believed aren't really compatible, and you get him to wrestle over how those two things can be true. Those types of questions will stick with a man, and they will gnaw at him until he gets an answer. Questions are way more sticky than facts. You know, in Reclaim Campfires, we are tilling up the soil of a man's heart, and we're bringing things to the surface that have been buried for a long, long time, and we are shining a light on them. We're helping men to think about things that they haven't thought about in a long time. Leave room for the Holy Spirit to work in that, and don't feel like you need to land the plane or close the deal on every idea and every concept that comes up at a campfire. You don't. The best thing that can happen is that the men that you're ministering to leave that meeting with questions that are gonna roll around in their head while they're trying to fall asleep at night. And they're not gonna be able to wait to be able to talk to their friend who's a reclaimed leader and is gonna help unpack that and flesh that out with them. One of the best things that we do to help set our leaders up for success is to create questions in the minds and the hearts of the men that we're ministering to at the campfire. So those are the 5 overarching principles that I hope come to the top of your mind every time you're thinking about or working with a campfire setting. Number 1, everything about a campfire should point to the proclamation of the gospel. Number 2, campfires are designed for the furthest out guy. Number 3, campfires are designed to help men have a positive experience at a spiritual event. Number 4, campfires always set reclaimed leaders up for success. And number 5, creating questions is more important than giving right answers. So with those 5 overarching principles in mind, let's go ahead and press into the details and talk about what a campfire looks like and how it's structured. Campfires are small to medium-sized group meetings. Usually 12 to 30 men will attend a campfire. We meet every other week, and we usually meet in settings that are a little bit more rugged and untamed. So somebody's garage, maybe a workshop or a barn, maybe even around a literal campfire if weather permits. But we're not hosting campfires in places like bookstores, coffee shops, extra classrooms at the church, not even somebody's living room. This sounds silly to say, but I've often said that a campfire setting, a good campfire setting, should pass the donut test. So here's the donut test. Imagine that you are in somebody's really nice house and they have a really nice plush living room, and you're standing there and somebody hands you a powdered cake donut and you have to eat it. So, you put your hand under your chin and you take a bite out of it, and the whole time it's like this low-level anxiety creeps in as you worry about how you're gonna manage the crumbs and powdered sugar that are falling off your face. Well, a good campfire setting passes the donut test. You should be able to eat a powdered cake donut without putting your hand under your chin and without worrying one bit about the mess that you're going to make. Now, again, it's a funny thing to talk about, but it does demonstrate that there's certain environments where men are just more relaxed, and we want a place where a guy can let down his guard. We don't want men to have to manage themselves and worry about making a misstep or saying something dumb. The environment helps alleviate that a little bit and let their guard down so that we can engage them better. So our environments, they appeal to the heart of a man. They feel relaxed and laid back. And the other thing is, they don't feel like traditional religious settings, right? It doesn't feel like church or even a place that a small group would meet. We work hard to leave tradition on the table. And oftentimes, someone who's been to 1, 2, or 3 campfires will come up to us and give us the feedback that, like, you know what, these meetings don't feel religious, or they don't feel churchy, is something that we often hear people say. In a campfire setting, we distance ourselves from what the contemporary Christian subculture feels like. And we do that because we often have men visiting who feel like they've been burnt by a church or that they've been burnt by a small group, and they just have negative ideas and feelings that they associate with those more traditional religious settings. And our leaders are working their tails off trying to reach these guys. They're pursuing them, they're building relationships, they're trying to earn the right to be heard so that they can get them to the threshold where they're willing to come to the campfire and to start to have spiritual conversations. And so we want to do our best to remove any unnecessary barrier. Keep in mind, every time that a man walks into a campfire for the first time, he's taking a risk. So we want to be wise and we want to be tender with how we handle the hearts of the men that attend the campfire. The way that we act, the way that we talk, and the setting that it takes place in are all designed to help men feel more comfortable and more relaxed so that they can better take in on a heart level what we're discussing and trying to share with them. When it comes to format, I like to describe the campfire as a spiritual conversation. It's a conversation that's designed to help deconstruct preconceived ideas that men have about Jesus, to help them understand the fundamentals of the gospel, and to consider what it means to be a man who follows Jesus. Like I said earlier in the 5 overarching principles, we don't try to teach men. We're not preaching at them. Campfire isn't a Bible study or a book study or a typical small group type discussion. The format is actually a panel discussion. So 3 to 5 reclaimed leaders form a panel up front. Now, these are men that know the Father well, and they understand the bigger story that God is telling and the role that they play in it. At each campfire, this panel discusses issues that pertain to the heart of a man and issues that men deal with day in and day out. And they have this discussion from a perspective that's raw, real, and transparent, and as men who follow Jesus. So sometimes somebody from the campfire may raise their hand and throw a question out, or they might have something to add to the conversation, so they throw something out there, and there's some back and forth between the panel and people in the audience. Every once in a while, the panel might ask a question of the audience broadly, and people can participate, but there's never a time where a man in the audience is going to feel like he's going to get called on or he's going to be required to share. We're never going to go around and make everybody share something or ask everyone a question. So a man can just come and sit in the audience and soak in the conversation and hear and consider what it's like for men who have made the decision to follow Jesus and to step into the greater story that God is telling. How do they live these truths out? What does it look like for them to navigate life? How do they face these situations? I sometimes say that a reclaimed campfire is like a live podcast. The great thing about this format is it allows our leaders to simply tell their story. Our leaders get to testify to what God is doing and has done in their life. They don't have to try to be convincing. They don't have to try to present compelling arguments or to teach and preach. They are sharing their experiences from their heart. They're talking about their mindset. They're sharing how they navigate life from a biblical worldview. And the men in the audience get to see and hear how Jesus informs all of their decisions, their big decisions and their small decisions. Because of this format, our leaders get to be witnesses in the truest sense of the word. And over a series of weeks and months, this presents a very compelling case for the gospel, one that's really hard to discredit and push back on. It's sort of like the story of the blind man whose sight was restored in John 9, right? He's like, I don't know, guys, I don't know. All I know is I was blind, and because of Jesus, I can see. That's my story. Are you going to argue with me about my story? Right? Nobody pushes back on a man who is blind and then has had his sight restored. In the same way, our leaders are sharing their stories. They're sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly, and testifying to how God has worked in their lives. It's difficult to refute their stories because these are men whose lives have been changed by Jesus. One of the other big benefits about this panel discussion format is the way that it creates questions in the minds of the men that are in the audience. Now, we talked about this in the 5 overarching principles of the campfire. Questions stick with guys, whereas information sometimes comes in one ear and out the other. Questions are something that they'll chew on for a long time. And the types of questions that men are thinking about oftentimes when they come out of a campfire are because they were drawn into a story that one of the men was sharing up front. They want to know the details. They want to know the background. Maybe they're experiencing something similar in their life and they could use some advice. So this format really lends itself to creating inroads into further conversation for campfire leaders. But here's the important thing to see. It does that not just because the men we're ministering to have questions that they want answers to and they're going to ask us. It also arms Reclaim leaders with questions to ask men. So once a man has been to several campfires, it gives Reclaim leaders literally dozens of entry points into deeper conversation with him. Now, in real life, it can sometimes feel challenging to bring religious or spiritual topics up with a man who isn't used to talking about spiritual things. Depending on comfort level, it can feel pushy or awkward to some men. It's not pushy or awkward at all to say something like, "Hey, what did you think about that story that Kevin shared last Tuesday night at the campfire? The one about how his grandfather took him to his very first Major League Baseball game. Wasn't that a great story? I've been thinking about it all week long." And all of a sudden, we've started a conversation. But he and I have a shared experience at the campfire that explicitly ties Kevin's story to a more spiritual story and spiritual principles. So as we progress in our conversation, it's easy and natural for me to direct it into deeper spiritual things. We're having a spiritual conversation now, and it doesn't even feel like I awkwardly brought up religion or pushed anything. It was just a natural progression of our conversation. It's one of the great side benefits of this panel discussion format at a campfire. Men in the audience are hearing dozens of stories about the lives of Reclaim leaders and giving us great talking points to enter into deeper spiritual conversations with them. The subject matter of each campfire is well thought out and very strategic and intentional. Now, the topics might vary from Reclaim area to Reclaim area, and Reclaim does provide a curriculum that leaders can follow to help guide campfire conversations. Or Reclaim leaders can get together as a team and create their own questions and their own conversations that they want to have at their campfire. The option is up to you, but all Reclaim campfires follow a very strategic progression. And that progression is important because it allows us to share the gospel over a season. That cycle is usually about 10 campfires long. Sometimes it's a little longer, sometimes it's a little shorter, but it's usually about 10 campfires. So the topics follow this progression. They start out with some topics that kind of hook men and pique their interest. Then there's a few campfires that focus on the character of Christ and showcase his life. They're designed to dispel myths and to deconstruct those preconceived ideas that people have about Jesus. Then we have a campfire that shares about the need in the world, a campfire conversation that talks about personal sin, one that talks about what Jesus did on the cross, one that talks about what it means to follow Jesus. And then finally, we like to close the season out with one or two leaders sharing their story and giving the testimony of how they came to know Christ and what their life has been like since they've decided to follow Jesus as Lord. So within leadership, these 7 different types of campfire conversations are referred to as hook, character of Christ, need, sin, cross, commitment, and story. So those 7 categories are not outward topics that we present to the campfire and talk to the men about. Those categories are designed to help leadership teams build their progression for the season. That being said, every campfire does have an outward topic, and each topic falls into one of those categories. So for example, if we're at the place in the season right now where in our progression we need to have a character of Christ conversation, maybe the topic this week is embarrassment. So we'll share with the men. Tonight, we're going to talk about embarrassment. What does it mean to be a man and find yourself in an embarrassing situation? How do you deal with that? How do you react to it? Or maybe how do you react when someone near you is embarrassed and you're in their presence? How do you respond to that as a man? And the panel will have this discussion about embarrassment. And at some point in that conversation, someone will bring up the story from the scriptures of the woman who was caught in adultery and brought before Jesus, and how incredibly embarrassing that situation is. So the panel will talk about this and discuss this situation in the scriptures. And as they do, they're going to highlight the character of Jesus. They're going to talk about how unexpected his response was, how it was full of grace and full of wisdom. And so that night, when some of the men leave the campfire, they might be thinking that they got some good tips about how to navigate embarrassing situations. But hopefully many of them also will have had their view spun a little bit on who Jesus is. And maybe he's not the cosmic cop that's always trying to bust you for everything that you've done wrong in life. Another example, maybe we're at the place in the progression where we need to have the cross conversation. Maybe the outward topic for that night is the word sacrifice. Sacrifice is an idea that's very important to men. You sacrifice for those around you that you love, and people in your life have sacrificed for you. How do you respond to that when somebody sacrifices to you? So the panel is going to flesh all of this out and have a great conversation about this rich idea of sacrifice. And at some point in time, we will talk about Jesus and the ultimate sacrifice that he made on the cross and what that means for all of us. So that's kind of how the outward topic that is designed to appeal to the heart of a man and draw a man in fits into each of those 7 categories. Another thing that Reclaim leaders need to keep in mind is the mixed audience that's at a campfire. At any established campfire, there's 4 groups of men. 1, there's Reclaim leaders. 2, there's men who don't yet know Jesus. 3, there's men who are young in their faith and who are growing in their faith. And 4, there's more mature Christians who are missionally minded. Remember, the campfire meeting is an open meeting, so anybody can show up and come to it. And frankly, Christians in the community love to come to the campfire. It is a fun time. It's a fun meeting. The gospel's being proclaimed, and we're talking about spiritual things. So remember, these topics that we are using as outward topics, things like embarrassment and sacrifice, those ideas are used to draw men in, and we want to springboard off of them and get to the basic truths of the gospel. But the reason that those topics work is that they're still incredibly relevant to the heart of a man. And the conversation around those topics is centered around biblical principles. The campfire is still a great place to be and a great conversation to take in and be part of, regardless of where you are in your spiritual journey. In fact, it's almost always the case that there's more Christians in a campfire than there are non-Christians, and that is totally fine. In fact, it's actually a really good thing. We need Christians in the room to help sort of create a critical mass so that we can be the thermostat that sets the temperature for the moral and spiritual temperature of the room. You know, we want to be inviting non-Christian guys into the body of Christ, into Christian community. When a room has mostly non-Christian men in it, it's a very different feel and a very different dynamic, and there's very different conversations before and after the campfire. And frankly, it's just helpful to have 3/4 of the room nod their head and smile when you say something great about Jesus, instead of having most of the room roll their eyes. That type of dynamic and that type of energy is incredibly helpful. But you have to be aware, and you have to manage some of the Christian personalities for sure in a campfire. If you've run it for a while, sooner or later, you're gonna end up getting guys there that are really quite churchy, who don't understand the vision. They want to participate all the time, and they want to talk about things like doctrine and theology, and they want to go too deep and make condemning comments. And that type of thing can absolutely torpedo the type of environment that you are working so hard to build. So you have to build relationships with everybody that's showing up at the campfire, and you have to be willing to manage some of those personalities outside of the meeting space. Sometimes that's as easy as just sharing the vision of Reclaim and getting someone to see what we're trying to do. And sometimes it can be a much more difficult conversation that can end in maybe the campfire meeting isn't the best place for you. So either way, it's something you have to be aware of and we have to manage as leaders. That being said, I really think that one of the greatest benefits of establishing a campfire in a community is the amazing evangelistic tool that you provide to those Christian men who are missionally minded, but who are not Reclaim leaders. It doesn't take long for that group of men to understand that the campfire is a safe place, there's a low barrier to entry, and the gospel is being proclaimed in a way that is incredibly relevant and easy to understand for men. And so they can bring their friends who they're trying to share Jesus with, especially their friends who aren't ready to go with them to church. So for the guy who wants to share Christ with his coworkers, his neighbors, his friends, you are providing him with an amazing evangelistic tool in his community. I sometimes find it helpful to think about these 4 different groups of men that comprise a campfire in terms of concentric circles, where at the very center, you have Reclaim leaders. Then you have mature Christians who are missionally minded. Then Christians who are young in their faith that are there and they're growing Christians. And then a group that I'll call spiritual explorers, men who don't yet know Jesus, but they're willing to come to a campfire and listen to and hear about spiritual things. So this infographic is not intended to represent the size of these groups in your campfire, but rather it helps us think about where men are in their journey with Reclaim. And this can be helpful for Reclaim leaders to think through this grid. It can help you not get ahead of yourselves as you pursue guys, as you pray for them, and as you build relationships with them. You want to always be thinking that as you come alongside people in their journey, you want to help them to take one step closer to the center. So for those guys who are on the outside, spiritual explorers, men who don't yet know Jesus, you want to be unpacking with them the basic truths of the gospel, who Jesus is, what he did, what does it mean to be a man who follows Christ. Encourage them to place their faith in Christ and begin a relationship with the Father. For the young Christians at your campfire, you want to continue to talk about those basic gospel truths and reinforce them. But also, you may be thinking more about discipleship things, unpacking some of the biblical truths that we talk about in the campfire, possibly getting them plugged into a Trek group. And definitely, you want to begin casting for them a vision for their friends. Start to develop in them a missional mindset. For those Christians who are missionally minded and mature in their faith at your campfire, you definitely want to be trying to get them plugged into a Trek group and having those conversations, but you also probably want to be sharing about the vision of Reclaim. What is our mission? What are we trying to accomplish in this ministry? And what does potential leadership look like for them at the local level? Now, I totally understand that not everybody who is a mature Christian at your campfire wants to be a Reclaim leader, and many of these men are already very committed to other ministry obligations, but this is definitely a pool that we want to be looking at as we grow our local area leaderships. So just a couple other items that I'd like to hit on before we wrap up the overview of the campfire section. The men in this outer circle, the spiritual explorers, these are guys that have been with us for a while now, right? We've met them in expedition, they've followed us through adventures, and now they're at the campfire hearing about spiritual truth and hearing the gospel. As those men come to know Jesus, as Reclaim leaders, we have a great opportunity to take our relationship with them up to the next level and make it a more formalized, one-on-one discipleship mentorship type relationship where we can help men to learn how to read and study the Bible, how to pray, and how to walk with Jesus day in and day out. We don't just want to see men make a prayer, we want to see them fully alive. And so the first step in that is to get them grounded in the basics of the faith and to be able to feed themselves. There's no mechanism that gets a young Christian grounded better than one-on-one discipleship. So this is true of men who are coming to faith, but it's also true for this second circle of young Christians that are showing up at the campfire, men who are young in their faith. There are opportunities to engage in one-on-one discipleship type relationships all over the campfire. And as leaders, we need to be watching for those and taking advantage of those opportunities. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about discipleship and how that's done further down the road, but you need to be aware that that is happening and it's something that leaders need to watch out for. Along the same lines, the campfire serves as a tremendous on-ramp to get people plugged into the local church. Many of these Christians in this second circle are already plugged into a local congregation, but don't assume that. Many of them are not. And even if a man hasn't yet come to know Jesus, if he's at the campfire, he's been for a little while, he's pursuing things of the faith, he's wanting to learn about spiritual things, don't be afraid to invite them with you to go to church at that point, to go with your family and to get them plugged in at a local church. We want men to be part of the local body. So the sooner we can make that happen, the better. The final point that I'll make about the campfire is this, and I just said this a few minutes ago, but men from the growing Christians and the mature missional Christians space, these two circles, this is a key pool of guys for starting Trek groups. We need to get men into Trek. I can't underscore the importance of pursuing those relationships, having those conversations, and being strategic about how you can create Trek groups out of the men in these two circles. Our vision is to see all men fully alive. And I can honestly say that I don't know of any tool that is better at helping men discover and step into the promise of John 10:10 than Trek groups. So we need to constantly be working to get those guys into Trek. That wraps up my overview of the campfire section. I want to transition now and talk for a little while about Trek. It's our hope that any man who knows Christ and is involved in Reclaim will at some point go through Trek. So Trek is an intense group discipleship program that we couple with weekend events that we call Beyonds and Intensives. So Trek walks men through an experiential curriculum that helps them to understand their own heart and the heart of the Father. I know that if you're watching Module 1 right now, you've at least gone through Trek 1 that we call Awaken. And if you're going through the full leader training, you've gone through Trek 1 and Trek 2 that we call Story. You're very familiar with what Trek is like. You've spent a lot of time in Trek already. So in this overview, I'm not going to go over the details of what Trek is like, but I do want to take some time to talk about our bigger picture thinking with Trek and how it fits in to the broader strategy of Reclaim. Again, the vision of Reclaim is to see all men fully alive. And Trek is where we are helping men step into the promise of John 10:10 and to really find freedom and life. Now, I would not say, none of us would say, that in order to find full life, you have to go through Reclaim's Trek program. That's not true. But we would say that you can't experience the full life that Jesus promised without the full application of the gospel in your life. And Trek is where we are helping men understand how to apply the gospel in every aspect of their life and to find life and freedom. In the Trek experience, if I had to bullet point it quickly, I would say this. Number one, men are awakened to the greater story that God is telling, and they begin to understand that they have a part to play in it. They become aware of the heart of the Father and what God's heart is like. They also grow an awareness of their own heart. They learn how they're wired, they learn their identity, and later in Trek, they begin to understand the holy desires that God creates within us on a heart level. Men find freedom in Trek from sin, from lies, from agreements. Men also learn how to live authentically and how to step into real, authentic relationships with other men. Relationships where they can be transparent and real, and where they can push each other towards holiness and towards life. And I would also say that in Trek, men develop a true sense of mission. Now, those 6 bullet points are not an exhaustive list of all of the things that God does in the heart of a man when they go through the Trek program, but they're sufficient for a quick overview. And it gives you an idea of the type of man that we're talking about when we talk about a man who is fully alive. Our world desperately needs men like this, because these are the types of men who are uncompromising and who will not stop when it comes to moving God's kingdom forward. You know, when I think of Trek, I often think of this quote from John Eldredge in his book, Waking the Dead. He says, "The story of your life is the story of the long and brutal assault on your heart by the one who knows what you could be and fears it." I think it's an incredibly sobering quote that speaks to the entanglement that we face every day as Christians and the battle that rages around us and keeps us from sharing the gospel with others. But this quote, as sobering as it is and as much truth as there is in it, I'm not knocking on John Eldredge when I say this, it's kind of a glass half empty quote. All of the truths that are expressed here through the power of the gospel can be flipped around and turned on their head. This truth could be read a different way. It could be read like this: the story of your life could be the story of a company of men who came alongside you to fight for your heart on behalf of the one who knows what he created you to be, loves you, and desires to see you fulfill your purpose. We want to see men step into this story. And I'm telling you, there is nothing that you can do to further the Great Commission more than to see a man set free and made fully alive. A man who is free will always result in a man who loves others, who shares the gospel, who disciples, and who moves God's kingdom forward. Seeing men experience that level of freedom and that type of intimacy with the Father is not just a deliverable for Reclaim. It's not just an output for us. It's actually critical for our growth as an organization and for us moving the bigger mission of Reclaim forward, because we are designed to be scalable, sustainable, and replicable. So we need to produce leaders. Now, I want you to hear this crystal clear. We do not want men to go through Trek so that we can produce Reclaim leaders. In Reclaim, we want men to go through Trek so that they will experience freedom in life. That being said, we will never place a Reclaim volunteer or staff leader without first having them go through the Trek process. Our leaders have to be stepping into this mission from a place of wholeheartedness. They need to be equipped to be able to deal with issues on the heart level within themselves, and they need a team of men around them who are willing to fight for them, a team that they can be transparent with, and who will push them towards holiness and life. A lot of men would say that they have tight-knit community in their church or in their small group, but that is not the same as having a team of men that is dedicated to fighting for your heart and who's been equipped with the tools to do so. Men who have gone through Trek have demonstrated that they've used those tools and they've leaned into that team. This is something that we are really passionate about when it comes to leadership, because Trek is so effective at identifying bleeds before men become ministry leaders. And this is something that's endemic in our Christian subculture right now. It seems like every week there's a different Christian leader, a pastor, a small group leader that has a moral failure, and it blows up a church or a ministry or a small group, and the fallout is absolutely devastating. The common thread in moral failures among Christian leaders is almost always that man had a bleed for a long, long time. You know, in the public eye, sin reveals itself and things blow up really quickly, seemingly overnight. But that sin was usually manifesting in a hidden way for years. And that's because when a man first steps into Christian leadership and he has success and he begins to grow as a Christian leader, the enemy is actually completely fine with your sin remaining hidden. He's fine that your pornography addiction is a secret. He's fine that somebody covers for your anger problem and enables you. He's fine with the fact that nobody realizes you're a functioning alcoholic that drinks alone. He'll wait decades even, so that when those issues do come out, you're in a place where it will completely blow up a ministry. It will destroy other people's reputations, and it will wound countless people. He'll gladly help you hide it so that he can maximize his down road collateral damage. And I get it. When you're seeing success in ministry and you're growing in responsibility, it gets harder and harder to be transparent. Your reputation is growing, your ego gets in the way, it can feel incredibly embarrassing. There comes a point where you feel like if you are going to be transparent with your ministry team, you're putting the spiritual well-being of the people that you're ministering to at risk. I mean, they look up to you and they count on you. The reality is, most men who are in leadership positions don't have a team of men around them that they can be completely transparent with. And even if they do, it's not just about having friends that you can be real with and transparent with. It's about making sure that your brotherhood has been equipped with the tools that they need to address issues on the level of the heart, and that they can help you navigate on the heart level and push you towards freedom and life and holiness. It is super important that people who are placed in leadership positions and who have responsibility put on their shoulders are given what they need to be successful, both in what is seen and in what is unseen. And that is something that we are unalterably committed to. A few closing thoughts on the practical aspects of forming Trek groups. I know that you've experienced Trek, but you've probably only been in 1 or 2 Trek groups at the most, so you have a small sample size, and I just don't want to assume that you know this. But when it comes to Trek groups, all Trek groups are small. 6 to 10 people is ideal. We do not do large 30-person Trek groups in Reclaim. More than 10, and it's hard to get everyone to share, and it's more difficult to form a tight-knit group of men. Less than 6 is doable, but there's a limited number of perspectives, and it's easier for 1 or 2 personalities to really dominate those conversations. So unlike Campfires, Trek groups are closed groups. The only way that you can get into a Trek group is by selection, and really after the first week or 2 at the most, you cannot add more guys to a Trek group. As you know, you end up sharing a lot of personal details about your life and your heart in a Trek group, so it's important that right off the bat, the relationships in that group of men begin to feel stable and secure and safe. And the best way to do that is through consistency. So not only can you not be adding men into a Trek group, but you really need to start a Trek group with men who are committed to seeing that Trek through. It's pretty discouraging to have people who are inconsistent about showing up or dropping out when you're 5-6 weeks into the session together. The other thing that's really important, I think, in terms of building those relationships in that group and kind of facilitating those great friendships is doing things intentionally as a group outside the spiritual discussion time. So make sure in the first couple of weeks that you launch a Trek group, you guys go grab wings together, go to a game, hang out at somebody's house for dinner, and get in the habit of doing that somewhat regularly. Time spent together outside of the spiritual conversation is going to pay dividends when you guys are together digging in deep at the material. The last thing that I'll say about Trek is this, that as Reclaim leaders who are pulling together Trek groups and running an area, you want to give some thought to selection when you start new Trek groups. You don't just want to grab 5 guys here or 10 guys there and start a Trek group without giving some thought to the personalities that will be in play. Consider their personalities, consider pre-existing relationships, and what dynamics will be like between certain men. Certain guys you can put in a Trek group and it's going to tank a Trek group because of somebody else that's in there with them. You got to think about those things. If you spend some time on the front end putting the right guys together in a Trek group, it's really going to help things out and help things go smoother down the road. And I realize that in new areas or smaller areas, sometimes that's a luxury and you can't always do that. If you can, it's super beneficial. So this concludes the conversation about Trek, and it actually concludes this video number 6 on campfires and Trek and an overview of those pieces of the Reclaim ministry model. There's a lot of information in this video, so watch it a few times, but also rest assured, I'm sure you have some holes. We're gonna go into a lot more detail about campfires and Trek when we talk about them in Module 3 and really get into how to run a great Trek group and how to run a campfire. We are almost through Module 1. There is one video left, video 7, and in this upcoming video, I'm gonna recap a few ideas. We're gonna talk a little bit more about the model big picture and talk about some overall ministry philosophy and how it applies to the Reclaim ministry model. So I'll see you soon in video number 7.